for joining us today for our Beyond Stoicism event. We have got a very interesting lineup. We've got fantastic panelists to talk about this topic. I mean, you really couldn't pick three other fellows who could delve into this topic so beautifully. And it's great because the three of you know each other for so long as well. So you get a little bit of that extra banter, which can only happen with people who've gotten to delve into these topics over the years. I want to say, for those of you who I'm new, my name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And if you've never checked out our site, you can go to classicalwisdom.com and you can check out our Substack. We've got a free newsletter, cool stuff for members, and including events like this. So we really appreciate the interest and support in the classics and the love of ancient history and philosophy. It's more important now than ever. Well, it's always important, but it's wonderful to have a growing community of people who feel like-minded on this. I want to say a quick thanks to Sean Kelly, our managing editor, who will be helping out from behind the scenes. And also just a quick order of events. We'll be discussing a bit about, what kind of approach we should have to understanding philosophy to begin with, and then kind of going into Stoicism versus, a lot of the other ancient philosophies that we have at our disposal. And considering that Stoicism has become so popular, which is great, it's also wonderful to kind of look beyond Stoicism and discover what else we can learn from the ancient world. So with that, I want to welcome our fantastic panelists. John Sellars is a reader in philosophy at Royal Holloway, University of London, a visiting research fellow at King's College London, and a member of Common Room at Waltham College, Oxford. He works mostly on Stoicism and is involved in modern Stoicism and the Aurelius Foundation, and he is the author of many books, including The Pocket Epicurean and most recently Aristotle, Understanding the World's Greatest Philosopher. So involved in modern Stoicism and an Epicurean and Aristotelian. So that's fantastic. Donald Robertson is a writer, cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, and trainer, specializing in teaching evidence-based psychology skills, and is the president of Plato's Academy Center. Donald is the author of several books and many articles on philosophy, psychotherapy, and psychological skill trainings, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor and the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, and most recently is How to Think Like Socrates. So our regular attendees may have remembered our recent Socratic event. So I really like that we really are covering all of the ancient philosophical bases. And finally, Massimo Pigliucci is an author, blogger, podcaster, as well as the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. Massimo publishes a regular column in philosophy called The Art of Living, and his books include How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life, Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk, and his newest book out today, congratulations, is Beyond Stoicism, A Guide for the Good Life with Stoics, Skeptics, Epicureans, and other ancient philosophers. And I love that you're celebrating your pub day with us.
That's right.
Getting into it. So we're starting early because Massimo has to go out to dinner in Paris afterwards to celebrate. We're very proud of him. And I'm so pleased that you guys could join me today. So I want to start getting into it right away. And I think it's always good to question with the premise at first. I think the ancient philosophers would agree with me on that. Can one school of philosophy be sufficient for a good life? Can any philosophy have a monopoly on truth? So is it best to be consistent or eclectic? What do you guys think?
Well, it can, whether it should or not, it's a different question. So clearly, the ancient did think that one school was enough. The Stoics thought that everybody else was wrong, and so did the Epicureans, and so did the Platonists, and so on and so forth. And certainly, one can reasonably say, look, I'm following one particular school of thought, and that doesn't require necessarily the implication or the assumption that that school of thought is the only one that is viable. It might very well be that there are different approaches to a good life, to a life worth living, that are equally valid or similarly valid, but one you have to pick one, and so one goes with either Stoicism or whatever. being eclectic, it's a good idea. It sounds good, uh, but one needs to be very careful because there is a reason why people spend so much time developing a philosophy of life. A philosophy is supposed to be, at the very least, not only useful but also internally coherent. And if one starts picking and choosing things as one likes, then the risk of becoming incoherent and putting together things that really don't belong is actually significant. So I would say no, it's not necessary that there is only one philosophy. I don't believe that one approach is the correct one. But at the same time, one needs to be a little bit careful if one wants to be an eclectic.
Donald, do you want to add in on that?
I just add from my perspective that we have a kind of similar debate in the field of psychotherapy because there's like hundreds of different models of psychotherapy. And one of the pioneers of behavior therapy, one of my heroes, a guy called Arnold Lazarus. And Arnold Lazarus directly addressed this question. And he said, well, the answer is yes and no, right? As always, the best answer to most questions. Lazarus said we should be technically eclectic. So we should take ideas and practices from different schools of thought, but we should be theoretically integrative. So we should have a coherent theoretical framework that we fit those bits and pieces within. And in that regard, I think he's actually in agreement with Seneca, who says that we should go and steal ideas and even sayings from rival schools such as the Epicureans. But Seneca also says we should modify the meaning of those things so that they're consistent with the fundamental principles of the philosophy that we follow. Otherwise, we end up contradicting ourselves. And that's something that most philosophers are keen to avoid.
John, do you want to add in, or do you want to add to continue? In which way should we curate our own philosophy then? Because I mean, as you say, like there are so many different philosophical ideas out there, and if we want to be consistent, how can we do that? I mean, that sounds like a lot of work.
Yes, I mean, just to build on what Massimo and Donald were both saying, I mean, a lot of it depends on what we mean by the word eclectic, right? So I think picking up on what they've both been saying, you need a kind of a core point of departure, a core kind of theoretical approach, a kind of a core set of values, and you want consistency across all of the things that all of the different views that you're trying to hold together. But within that, you can draw from wherever you think you can find useful information that is consistent with your kind of core beliefs and your core values. So you might draw from a wide variety of different ancient philosophers and different philosophical schools, but you don't want that to be just a hodgepodge of things that don't really fit together. You're going to have to be very careful and selective about what it is that you're pulling in. And yeah, and as Donald said, with regard to techniques in particular, it might be that there are some useful ideas and techniques we can take from almost all of the ancient philosophers, but they're going to have to fit in some way, in a coherent way, with whatever core beliefs that we have. And just one other footnote I wanted to sort of add to that opening question as well was the idea that you be a kind of, I mean, this is a discussion I had with Brad Inwood a while back to do around Stoicism in particular. What you often find in the literature on Stoicism, and I've done this and many others have, is we fall into the language of orthodox versus heterodox, and we use what is ultimately theological language to talk about philosophers, right? This guy's the orthodox Stoic, and this other guy is heterodox in some way because he disagrees about some certain point. And the point that Brad was stressing, which I think is a really important one that I've been thinking a lot about recently, is that's a really unhelpful way to think about philosophy, right? I mean, if you're an ancient Stoic philosopher or a philosopher interested in any of those schools, it's not as if there's an orthodoxy that you unthinkingly subscribe to and you buy the whole package, right? If you're a philosopher, then you're thinking about whether you find any of these claims true or not. And in the history of ancient Stoicism in particular, we see loads and loads of different Stoic thinkers reported for having rejected certain claims, right? Someone might not be so interested in preferred indifference. Someone else might doubt the idea that the world is consumed with fire every 10,000 years. Lots of Stoics kind of remain Stoics without buying every single belief that every previous Stoic said. And so I think that's another sort of important element that is worth bearing in mind.
You can
Can I
be a
just add
Stoic
something
without
to that?
having to take cold showers every day, basically, right?
Right.
Go ahead.
It might be worth saying as well that from the outset, Stoicism was, in a sense, an eclectic philosophy in that Zeno drew influences from many other preceding schools of philosophy and wrote about and discussed their ideas. And then also immediately following him, his students began disagreeing with him. We're told that Chrysippus disagreed with many of the things that Zeno said, for example. So right out of the gate, there was disagreement among the Stoics, and they were drawing on different influences.
Massimo, do you want to add to that? I think about with regards to how we can curate our own philosophy, and also if it needs to be sort of an individual endeavor.
Right. So no, the point that Don just made is important. Many philosophies, and certainly Stoicism is one example. They actually start out as eclectic, but it's interesting in the case of Stoics. So Zeno, we know, spent several years uh, studying with different kinds of people, different philosophers, right? So he studied with the Cynics, he studied with the Platonists, he studied with the Megarians. And then he took what he thought were interesting bits and pieces from each one of these and studied his own teaching at the Stoa Poikile. However, initially, we surmise this was a little bit of a mess. So much so that Chrysippus did come in, the head of the Stoa, who was a logician and presumably bothered by logical incoherence, and started cleaning up the house, so much so that the commentator Diogenes Laertius tells us that if not for Chrysippus, there would be no Stoa, meaning that what we refer to as Stoicism today, it's actually really more Chrysippus's creation than Zeno. That is an interesting tale, I think, because it tells you right there both that yes, of course, philosophies can start eclectically and can accumulate different kinds of ideas, but B, also you need to be careful not to make a mess out of it, just like John was saying. And we do need, or we need to maintain the kind of theoretical coherence that Don was talking about earlier on. So I would say, don't start your own philosophy right away. Take a hint from Zeno, who apparently studied for more than 10 years with other people before actually studying his own thing. And even then he made a mess out of it. So, it's one of the interesting things is we can build on 2.5 millennia of efforts by other people, not just in the Greco-Roman tradition, not just in the Western traditions, but also in the Eastern traditions, in the African traditions, the Mesoamerican traditions. So we have a lot to choose. I bet that pretty much everybody would find something valuable in what is already available. And then, if you really have to start your own thing, by all means, but at least be careful and know what you're doing.
That does sound like it could potentially be a bit overwhelming. You have to study all of the world's histories of philosophies.
Right.
But also that it's almost like a superhuman effort to be consistent, I do think you're right that there's so many good ideas out there, and it would be easy, like it's going to be like going into a fertile field and just picking different fruits and vegetables as you see fit. How do you need a logician? Do you need somebody who's really structured and logical to make a good meal out of those eclectic fruits and vegetables? To torture a metaphor.
I like your metaphor, actually. I like your analogy, because just as in the way of cooking, right? So I like cooking at home, but I don't go and randomly put together stuff, right? If I make a dish, it's not a random thing. I don't necessarily follow a predetermined recipe, or if I do, I may make my changes depending on what's available and what I like or dislike, but I'm not going to go random. And no, I don't need to be, you don't need to be a professional cook, although certainly a professional cook would be helpful, and it would be, a better way to learn how to do things. So I think it's something similar. Ultimately, at the end of the day, a philosophy of life has to work for you. It has to be useful. It is a question of pragmatism to some extent, right? I mean, what do we want a philosophy of life for? Not because we need a creed of some sort. We need some help navigating life, making priorities, making choices, living the kind of life that at the end of it, you look back and you say, that was not a waste. And there are presumably many different ways of doing so. But again, I would not do it randomly. Be careful what you do, because the dish might actually not taste that good at the end of the day.
Go ahead.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, if you've got a sense of what your core values or your core priorities are, then you can use those to assess a particular thing you come across. And it's like, would this be useful for me? Would this fit with my existing outlook that I'm committed to? And so if you're assessing things, one piece at a time, so to speak, a bit like looking at your pile of potential ingredients in the kitchen, you can decide, okay, would that one work, or would that one, not be suitable on this occasion? And if you think about it in that way, it seems like a fairly manageable process. If you do this kind of sort of huge research project where you gather every bit of wisdom from all of the world's traditions and throw them on a table and then try and say, okay, what are the bits that are going to fit together? That feels like a much more difficult prospect. So that's perhaps not the way to go about it.
Donald, do you want to add to that from even like a psychological standpoint?
Yeah, just an observation. I think, in a sense, there are three ways in which we resolve contradictions in our philosophy. One is by sitting in a nice, comfortable armchair with your slippers and your pipe, and getting a pen and paper and reflecting on it, questioning your thinking logically and spotting contradictions, like many philosophers might do. And the other one is more like ancient philosophers would do, which is to debate it with other people and get actively involved in discussing your ideas with a variety of different people who have different perspectives. And then the third is to test things out in practice through trial and error learning, and to try and apply different concepts and ideas and observe from your experience whether it leads to contradictions in practice or not. And there are additional things that you need to do in order to benefit from all of those three different forms of identifying contradictions. But those are ways. I think the Stoics actually did all three of those things in order to develop their philosophy.
And I must say, having spoken to the three of you over the years, I know that this is something you three have done. And it's one thing that I really like in a lot of your work too, is to kind of get into the practical aspects of it so you can practice it and see, philosophy in action. I think it's a really important way of appreciating philosophy and using it and utilizing it, and not just thinking it's something you're supposed to read about, to actually use it. And with that said, I kind of want to actually start off with sort of our toolbox to switch now to another metaphor of philosophical ideas and to kind of look at Stoicism to begin with, because I think Stoicism is very popular, and it is very popular for a reason. And the three of you are, integral to the modern Stoic movement and group. So what would you say are some of the most critical elements of Stoicism that are still valuable, that are very valuable and useful today? And I want to just preface with this, that I know that, especially with the three of you, we could easily fill an entire conversation just on this topic, easily. And I know that has been done. So I'm going to attempt the impossible by requesting a simple or shorter answers, because I do want to show the rest of the philosophies that can be used as well. So maybe like pick two or three each that you think is just, I don't know, maybe that's like picking your favorite child, but what are some of your top Stoic useful things?
Well, everyone has a favorite child, even though they deny it anyway. So sure, why not? Well, my favorite, my top is probably not surprisingly Epictetus's fundamental rule, what is sometimes called the dichotomy of control, which I think it's actually misleading terminology, because it's not really about control, right? So this is actually such a useful idea that actually pops up in different traditions. You find it in 8th century Buddhism, you find it in 11th century Judaism, and you even find it in modern Christianity in the form of the Serenity Prayer that opens meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous. So this notion that things in the world are divided into these two broad categories. Things that are up to us, meaning for which we are responsible or reasonably responsible, and things that are not up to us, meaning things that for which ultimately, at least, we're not responsible, is very useful. But the more important part is the bit that comes after, which is where Epictetus says, okay, here are the things that are actually up to you. Here are the things that are not up to you. And a good life is the result of focusing on the first ones and sort of training yourself to accept the rest with equanimity. First of all, we could all use more equanimity. And therefore, and society at large certainly could use more equanimity. So this notion that, there's going to be lots of things that are not up to us and about which it's really not useful to get upset and to throw a tantrum and all that sort of stuff. It's incredibly useful psychologically and practically. But when he says, here's what up to you, it turns out, he does list 3 or 4 things, but it really comes down to one thing only, your judgments. Because he says, what's up to you is your judgments in general, and then your decisions to act and not to act, and the values that you endorse or reject. But those are all, in fact, forms of judgments, right? In order for me to decide whether to act or not to act in a certain situation, that's a judgment. And to endorse or not certain values, that's also a judgment. So it really comes down to, it's only judgments. In other words, it's only the intentions that I can put into play in my life. Then the outcome of those actions or intended actions are not up to me, because ultimately they depend on factors that I don't control. That is so liberating and is so useful, practically useful, that, as I said, it comes up in a bunch of different traditions. The only thing that concerns me is when I see some Stoics or modern Stoic practitioners who take that and then ignore, however, the ethical background. Because after all, what I said up to this point, a psychopath could do as well. A psychopath could say, hey, there are certain things that are up to me and other things that are not up to me, and I should focus on the first one and accept the other ones with equanimity. But he would still be a psychopath. He wouldn't be doing the right things. And of course, Epictetus in general does tell us quite a bit about what the right thing or the virtuous thing actually is. So once you couple that notion of the fundamental rule with the proper ethical background, and here's where the other 1 or 2 ideas that I prefer, that I like most in Stoicism, come in. One is the notion of cosmopolitanism, this idea that we're all in the same big family together, and we better act like we were a family, otherwise we're going to sink the ship, and the ship is the entire planet at this point, because we live in a global society. So that's the second idea, cosmopolitanism. And the third one is that we should live by doing our best to using reason. Every time that I bring up reason, invariably somebody says, oh, but you're such a rationalist. What about, things that go beyond reason? I'm not sure what beyond reason actually means. But if the implication is that there is too much reason in the world, and therefore we don't need to be concerned with pushing reason, I don't know where these people live. I don't think that our main problem at this moment is that there is too much reason in the world, therefore we don't need to push it. I think we do. So those are the 3 ideas: fundamental rule, reason, emphasis on reason, and cosmopolitanism.
Who wants to go next? It's like Massimo, it's like when at Thanksgiving and everybody has to go around and say what they're thankful for or something. You always want to be the first person because you can get the easy one. So then at the end.
Yep.
I've got quite an easy answer. I would say, the first book I wrote on Stoicism, I tried to list all of the useful ideas and techniques that I could find that were similar to ones in modern psychotherapy. And I went back and counted it. There were roughly 18. Right. So when you said earlier, there's a lot of stuff to discuss, right? Maybe give or take a few, right? Broad categories. I believe that the most important concept that Stoicism has to offer that is the idea, the cognitive model, as I would call it, of emotion. The idea that our emotions are shaped to a greater degree than we normally realize by our thinking and our underlying beliefs. That's the basic premise of cognitive therapy today. So the Stoics were right on the button with regard to that. And it just is an indication of how far ahead they were I don't say lightly that they were way ahead of their time. But, I only need to mention Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and the many psychotherapists that dominated the field for close on 100 years who had no idea the extent to which our underlying beliefs influence our emotions and underestimated that until Albert Ellis and the cognitive therapists came along and reintroduced that concept, inspired by Stoicism, brought about a revolution in the field of psychotherapy and foundation of evidence-based practice. That is what I technically refer to as a big deal in terms of progress in psychotherapy that was instigated and attributed to the Stoics. In terms of practical techniques, I mentioned there are at least 18 that I could list, but the main ones would be the view from above is a really useful concept that we don't really have many parallels to in modern psychotherapy, but makes total sense from a modern psychological point of view. Premeditatio malorum, which we actually have many techniques that resemble in modern psychotherapy. But this basic idea of mentally rehearsing future events is absolutely crucial to skills training in psychotherapy. And many people, it doesn't occur to them to do something like that. I think there's a natural tendency to avoid confronting our fears and imagination. So making the effort to do it is critical in terms of psychological improvement. And I think the other big thing, I think Massimo was alluding to this, is Stoic ethics and the concept of virtue ethics, which is also way ahead of its time. The basic idea of a virtue ethic really is foundational to a lot of modern psychotherapy research and character strengths and the field of positive psychology, what we call values work in the field of behavior therapy. It's the foundation, actually, of modern evidence-based treatment for clinical depression. Like, owes a great deal, not just to the Stoics, but to ancient virtue ethics in general. But the Stoics particularly exemplify that perspective. So there you go.
John, do you want to add? Do you have any ones left, or you want to kick off into the next segment of philosophical endeavor?
I think those guys have covered that all pretty good. But yeah, I think it's remains absolutely relevant today in terms of the ethics and the psychology and the way in which those two bits integrate into a really coherent system, and beyond the kind of the research into CBT that Donald knows all about and has mentioned, there's all sorts of other bits and pieces of psychological research that have been done that make no reference to Stoicism whatsoever, but seem to offer evidence for a variety of other Stoic beliefs. So we've got good reasons to think that there's lots of useful material here that's as relevant as it ever was.
So to start off then onto, Stoicism is really, really been absolutely monumental in its popularity and its direct helpfulness to so many people in the world. But as we kind of mentioned from the very beginning, like it is just one philosophy, and I think sometimes people don't realize that there are so many other ones that can bring value. So are there some places where you think Stoicism falls short? Or do you think there's some specific philosophies that can really add neatly into sort of already a Stoic belief or kind of contribute? And maybe, John, I know you've written about Epicurus, for instance. Maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, sure. So, obviously, I'm primarily sympathetic towards the Stoics, but that doesn't mean that we want to be closed-minded or uninterested in what other philosophers have to say, and they will make their points and offer us arguments and reasons, and if those are convincing, then we ought to listen very seriously. I don't think that the Stoics are wanting or lacking philosophically, we might say, but inevitably they don't discuss everything in the level of detail that we might like, right? And obviously for the early Stoics, we've only got scraps and fragments, and there's so much that was lost, right? So, and the other texts that we do have, like Seneca and Epictetus, they discuss specific topics. It's not as if any of the ancient Stoics give us this kind of comprehensive summer that touches everything that we want. So there are lots of potential gaps there where we can find more information and more detail from other ancient schools. So you mentioned Epicurus. Let me start with him. Now, obviously, there are some important fundamental differences between Stoicism and Epicureanism, and you can't just kind of throw it all together and assume that you'll come up with something that will make sense. But one of the kind of bits of practical advice that the Epicureans discussed was something that they called the fourfold remedy. So don't worry about death, don't fear the gods. What's good is easy to get, and what's difficult is easy to endure. And they use that brief reminder to remind Epicureans of arguments in all of those different topics. Now, it strikes me that a Stoic could quite easily embrace all of those ideas, which don't fundamentally sort of contradict with kind of core Stoic values, right? And in fact, we see later Stoics do precisely that. So Marcus Aurelius at one point repeats the Epicurean argument why we ought not to be concerned about death. The Stoics don't say much about death, but Epicurus says lots of very interesting things, and there's no obvious philosophical contradiction there. So I think a Stoic can certainly, with profit, read Epicurean texts and find useful advice that they can take, so long as you're paying attention to see precisely how well this might fit. Another example as well. So Aristotle, obviously, one of the greatest philosophers ever. Aristotle describes human beings as rational animals and as social animals. And those, of course, are two things that the Stoics would endorse. He thinks that virtue is absolutely fundamental for a good life, with which the Stoics would agree. And on a variety of other points, Aristotle is saying things that a Stoic could accept, even though there are some points of difference. And there was some debate in antiquity about precisely how close Aristotle and the Stoics were. And, some people wanted to kind of highlight the differences and stress that these were opposing ways of thinking about things, while others were far more conciliatory and said, well, actually, on the number of these points, perhaps this is really just a disagreement about terminology and not a huge philosophical difference. So there's a sense in which, since the beginning, there's been an open debate and conversation about how far or close Aristotelian ideas and Stoic ideas are. So depending on where you are in that discussion, it might be that there's actually a lot in Aristotle that's highly relevant to Stoicism, right? And even if you think there's a great distance, Aristotle's a smart chap. Everyone should read Aristotle. You're going to learn something. And even if you disagree with him about something, thinking through that is itself going to be a really valuable, intellectual exercise for all of us. So we should all be reading Aristotle, folks, whether you think he's right or not.
Yeah, I think Aristotle is not always the easiest of the philosophers to read, but yes, he's excellent insights. Now, I could see both Donald and Massimo having things to say. How do you guys think about Aristotle, maybe Aristotle's ethics versus Stoic ethics? I mean, Aristotle also wrote so prolifically about just about all the different interdisciplinary elements of philosophy. Is there a part where he's really discordant with the Stoics, or you think, or improve upon?
No, the one way to think about the difference between Aristotle and the Stoics, which by the way, it's a discussion that has been going on literally for more than 2 millennia, right? So Cicero, for instance, in the Finibus, in book 3 presents the Stoic system, and in book 4 criticizes the Stoic system. And his main criticism is like, you guys are just Aristotelians. What the hell are you talking about, right? You're just using different terminology, but the ideas are the same. And he himself didn't believe that, because he himself actually was very much leaning toward the Stoics in a number of respects, especially when it comes to the ethics. But of course, he was playing the skeptic, and the typical approach of the skeptic is precisely to bring all the arguments in favor and then all the arguments against, and not actually tell the reader what exactly you think, because they're supposed to make up their minds on their own. But in so doing, he makes a number of interesting points about the differences and the similarities between Aristotelianism and Stoicism. And one way to think about it is actually to include a third philosophy, cynicism. We all know that cynicism is a close cousin of Stoicism. In fact, Epictetus tells us essentially that if you can't be a cynic, at least be a Stoic. In other words, the cynics put the highest bar possible on the practice of virtue. But if you can't manage that much, at least be a Stoic. One way to think about the difference between these three is in terms of how these three philosophies relate virtue and so-called externals, right? So things like wealth and health and education and stuff like that. For all three philosophies, Cynicism, Stoicism, and Aristotelianism, virtue is essential. You cannot live a eudaimonic life. You cannot live a good life, a life worth living, unless you are acting virtuously. So in that respect, they're all three saying the same thing. The differences come with the externals. And I think one useful way to think about it is this. On the one hand, we have the cynics who say, out with the externals. Externals are getting in the way of virtue, right? That's why they adopted that famous minimalist lifestyle that gave them the name. Cynic means dog-like, right? Because the insult was meant to be, oh, you guys live like dogs. In other words, no family, no possessions, no house, no nothing, very few things. Why? Because the externals not only are not necessary, they really literally get in the way of practicing virtue. At the opposite extreme, we have Aristotle, who says, no, the externals, some of the externals at least, some degree of externals is necessary. You don't live a good life if you don't have a little bit of education, a little bit of money, a little, a good health, and even a little bit of good looks. Those things without virtue are not going to be good. But if you just have virtue, you're not going to have a lot of fun in life. So those are the two extremes, are kind of in a conceptual space defined by virtue and its relationship with the externals. On the one hand, the externals get in the way. That's the cynics. On the other hand, no, you absolutely need the externals. Some externals. That's Aristotle. The Stoics come in between. They say, well, the cynics are right that you can live a life worth living by just virtue, even without externals, even if you are sick or poor or uneducated or ugly, you can still live a life worth living, contra Aristotle. But of course, those externals do have value, axia in Greek, and therefore, if you have them, good for you. They're not necessary, they're certainly not sufficient, but they're kind of like a little spice that you add on your dish of virtue, and the spice does make the whole thing more palatable, so to speak. So I think that's a very useful way to think about the differences between these three philosophies, and also in general, what we ourselves think about the relationship between virtue and the externals.
Now, we're going to switch over to Q&A pretty soon. However, I feel like we've got a big Socratic hole in this conversation with regards to adding or subtracting or fitting in with Stoicism. And Donald, as you are the one who's most recently written a book about Stoicism, Socrates, where does he fit in with this? Because we've covered Aristotle, we've got a bit of Epicurus, but where's good old Socrates? And by extension, Plato.
We have no representative of Pythagoreanism, as far as I'm aware, either. But the Stoics were quite interested in the Pythagoreans. So that's maybe worth kind of giving them an honorable mention. Well, the Stoics were very heavily influenced by Socrates, and at least some of the Stoics saw Socrates as being one of the most important precursors, their main role model. Epictetus clearly absolutely idolizes Socrates and repeatedly tells his students that Socrates is the main person that they should be emulating. More in terms of his behavior, his conduct, the way he lived his life, than his philosophical views. Although Epictetus also employs the Socratic method with his students, I don't think we know the extent to which Stoics did that, but I presume it was fairly common for Stoics to emulate the Socratic method as well and engage in philosophical dialogues, which are really integral to, I mean, Socrates, we talk about the techniques that we find in Stoicism, right? By the way, as an aside, when I first became interested in the Stoics, it was because I read Pierre Hadot's books, and he reviewed all the different spiritual exercises or psychological exercises he could find in all the different schools of ancient philosophy, including Socrates, Pythagoreans. And after reading his books, I came to the conclusion that more or less every single one of those good ideas or techniques happen to exist within Stoicism. The Stoics had perhaps assimilated all of the practical techniques that were of interest to me from the other schools. That's why I specifically chose to focus on Stoicism. But with regard to the Socratic method, we don't really see that much of it in the Stoic texts. They have these visualization techniques and verbal techniques that they employ. But if we ask Socrates, he would have said the main thing that you should be doing is engaging in philosophical dialogue with other people, and raising questions about the most important things in life, as he tends to put it, our values, the concept of the good. In fact, in one of Xenophon's dialogues in the Memorabilia, I think we find something very fortuitous. The Socrates is talking to a young man called Euthydemus, and Euthydemus says to him, after he demonstrates the Socratic method to him, Euthydemus says, "Where should I begin doing this?" Which would be useful to know. And Socrates says, you should begin by examining the concept of what's good and bad in life. It was really, the concept of eudaimonia, of the good life, and, refining your conception of the goal of life, basically. And you could say that's implicit in everything that the Stoics do, but it's much more explicit in Socrates because we have the dialogues. So we see him in action, constantly questioning from every aspect, if you like, how to define the good life. And arguably, that's the most important technique of all. Although I often find in modern psychotherapy, I used to teach techniques to psychotherapists for many years, and I always thought the main obstacle that they encountered was they were unclear what was a technique and what was a theory, because often they would dismiss things as just an idea or just a concept or just a theory. And I think, no, that's a technique, So I think maybe the Socratic method is kind of hidden in plain sight. This is the most, people might not even view it as a psychological technique, but arguably it's the most important psychological technique of all. And it's obviously many modern psychotherapists from different schools have said that they consider themselves to be using a variation of the Socratic method that's integral, not just to cognitive therapy, in fact, to many other types of counseling and psychotherapy.
I'm going to echo Jeremy's comment when he says, I love when Donald starts with a reply with, here's just a bit of trivia, and then a truly interesting nugget follows. But you started off your comment bringing up Pythagoras, and I would like to just turn to Massimo, because I know in your book, Beyond Stoicism, you actually address both Pythagoras in the book, and you actually started maybe non-intuitively for our modern era with hedonism. So maybe you could add just a little sprinkle of good old Pythagoras can get a nod.
Yeah, so the book, Beyond Stoicism, as you said, comes out today. It's co-authored with my friends Greg Lopez and Meredith Kuntz. And what we thought was we wanted to present a exploration of most of the major classical and Hellenistic Greco-Roman philosophies from a point of view of practice, from a point of view of what would happen if I decided to live like an Epicurean or a Pythagorean or whatever it is. And we thought, okay, but how do we organize this thing? Or do we just go one by, after in alphabetical order, in chronological order, in which case Pythagoreanism would have been the first one, or what? And we decided that a good way of understanding, and that answers your question about, is going to answer your question about hedonism. A good way to think about it was okay, maybe there are three major ports, as we call it. We use a navigation metaphor. Three major ports that kind of identify the map of all classical and Hellenistic philosophies. The first one is the port of pleasure. There we find, for instance, Cyrenaicism, which is little known, but it was the original hedonistic philosophy, and Epicureanism. Then we have a port that we call the port of character, and that includes things like Aristotelianism, Stoicism, Cynicism, and Platonism. And then we have what we call the port of doubt, and those are Socrates, Protagoras, interestingly, so one of the sophists, and then two schools of skepticism, the Pyrrhonists and the academic skeptics. But then if you look at the book, there's a fourth part there that it's labeled "Here Be Dragons," because if you look at ancient maps, whatever the author of the map didn't know exactly what was going on in a certain area, it will label it "Here Be Dragons," meaning be careful. These are dangerous waters, and we don't know exactly what's out there. And in the dragons area, we put Pythagoreans, Megarianism, the Stilpo and the Megarians, and then Hypatia and the Platonists, the Neoplatonists. Why dragons? Because we don't think actually that one could reasonably live to get today like a Pythagorean or a Megarian or a Neoplatonist, either because we don't know enough about these philosophies to begin with to actually be able to practice them, or because they will really be awkward or weird from a modern perspective. A Neoplatonist would have to be somebody who's really into mysticism and really into weird ideas about how the world works. To be a Pythagorean, I don't know. I mean, are you happy if you're going to be staying away forever from beans? Because that was one of the major things that Pythagoras taught his students. But to go back to your question about Pythagoras, he was a fascinating character. I mean, we learned a lot doing research for this book about him. And the reason you can learn a lot is because actually there is not a lot to learn, meaning we don't know a lot about Pythagoras himself. A lot of the things that are attributed to him, they're probably not his. Like most people, for instance, if I mention Pythagoras, they would think about the famous theorem, right? And very likely he did not discover the theorem. It was one of his students. And he certainly didn't prove the theorem. But it is true that Pythagoras was interested in mathematics. He thought that numbers are the key to understanding reality. And that notion is still with us today. There are some modern mathematicians who still think that is in fact the case. Pythagoras was a mystic. He was. Some people said that he had a divine component. He went around allegedly with a golden thigh, which was a mark of divinity. You know, it was a very, very interesting figure, but much more of a mystic than a philosopher, and that's why we put him also in among the dragons, so to speak.
I always like that he's also famed for wearing trousers, so it's
right. Maybe to cover the golden tie or something.
Yeah. Trousers and fava beans. I mean, it's a whole unique world over there with Pythagoras. But yeah, fascinating once you get started. Now I'd like to switch over to Q&A so I can get our audience. We've already been receiving lots of good questions. Feel free to add more in the chat. And we've got a lot of good ones that are about Stoic philosophy or philosophy in general or comparative philosophy. So we are tackling quite a big subject here. And so I'm really appreciative to our three panelists who happen to be very knowledgeable about the wide range of philosophy and not just Stoic philosophy. But the first one is more specific to Stoic. And maybe I'll start off with you, John. What do you think? So this is a question from Mike. Do the experts find Stoic philosophy lacking in discussing disposition of the soul after death? And I've seen in the chat a lot of death talk, so perhaps that's the other elephant in the room to discuss.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so for the most part, I don't think the Stoics thought that the soul had any significant afterlife. The soul is kind of material stuff intermixed with the body. It structures and organizes and animates the body, and so when the body is broken up, the soul is broken up with it. There are one or two slightly weird passages which suggest that maybe the souls of the wise are so kind of strong and held together strongly that they might survive the destruction of the body for a short while and then kind of dissipate into the ether. But for the most part, the Stoics think the soul dies with the body, as you'd expect from kind of thoroughgoing naturalists that they were. Now, whether you think that that's a weakness or a virtue of Stoicism is going to depend on where you're coming from, right?
How would that compare to Aristotle's view on death?
Well, I mean, Aristotle's is going to be fairly similar. So for him, the soul is literally the form of the body. It's the structure, the organization, or to be more precise, it's the set of capacities that a living body has. And so when that living body is destroyed, obviously all of those capacities then end at the same time. So again, very similar to the Stoics. He's a naturalist, he's a biologist, and he's studying living organisms and not thinking about anything beyond the physical world, really. Unlike the Platonic and the Pythagorean tradition, which are coming from a very different perspective.
Can I just add that in a sense, it doesn't matter to the Stoics what happens to the soul after death, if anything, because they believe that virtue is its own reward. So the consequences for us in the afterlife of having a virtuous life would, in a sense, be irrelevant. You know, what motivates them is the idea that virtue itself is intrinsically good. You know, so the idea of an afterlife, I think, ties much more into a consequentialist view of ethics. Like if you behave in a virtuous manner, you'll be rewarded, or in the afterlife, you'll be punished if you behave sinfully. The Stoics, it seems to me, believe that this is a completely wrong-headed way of understanding ethics.
Matt, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say absolutely, and the same would apply to Aristotle too, right? That virtue is its own reward, and he'd go a bit further than the Stoics and say, actually, we gain pleasure from doing the right thing. We enjoy being good, right? So any reward that we get from it, we get immediately, rather than thinking about longer term consequences.
Now, usually when people bring up death in ancient philosophy, Epicurus is one of the first ones to kind of come. Do you think that when trying, because we've had a few events over the years, some specifically about death and some about anxiety, but it is not surprisingly a very recurrent theme and something that affects us all. So for those who might, and I can see in the comments, some find great comfort actually in the Stoic approach to death. Is there other ancient philosophies that we would say can bring a great deal of, I don't know, comfort, insight, perspective when it comes to the final question?
Well, so part of it is it depends on what do you want to be comforted about. Do you want to have comfort in the sense that you want somebody to tell you that you will in fact survive in some form after death, in which case, as John just said, you need to go Platonist or Neoplatonist. I mean, it's not a surprise, for instance, that the Neoplatonists were eventually absorbed into Christianity. So, a lot of those ideas kind of go into that direction. Or do you want to be comforted because you accept the notion that there isn't going to be survival after death? Therefore, you want some kind of response to the existential angst that may be generated by that, right? So it really depends on what you want to be comforted about. And then you're gonna be probably naturally gravitating toward one set of philosophies or the other. In terms of the Epicureans, I think it's interesting that for all the criticism that they get from the Stoics, or from the criticism they get from other people who are not Stoic. I mean, Cicero also is very critical of the Epicureans, and yet the Stoic position and the Epicurean position are essentially the same about death. And in fact, the Stoics like Seneca repeat arguments from the Epicureans. Cicero, who was neither an Epicurean nor a Stoic, it was an academic skeptic, repeats arguments from the Epicureans. And two of the ones that make sense to me and kind of comfort me in a sense are the so-called symmetry argument. So the notion that, like, why are you so worried about not existing for an eternity after death? Are you also distraught by the fact that you did not exist for an eternity before you were born? Probably not, right? Most of us don't go about and say, oh my gosh, I was not alive for an eternity before my birth, and that was really bad. It's like, no, it wasn't. You have no recollection, of course, of that status because there was no you to recollect anything. So the only difference there between the two situations, the before birth and after death, is just the way you think about it. Right? It's just that you are aware of the fact you're going to die, and so that creates the asymmetry. But that's entirely in your mind. It's not a fact about the world. And then the other argument is one that Epicurus explicitly makes, which is, well, if death, as we think, is the cessation of all of all sensation, then there literally will not be any you there to experience it, right? So he says, whatever death is, you are not, and whatever you are, death is not. Therefore, if anything, at worst, you might want to be concerned about the process of dying, but not death itself, because even when we think of death as a long, sleepless kind of interval in which you're essentially like dreamless interval, like you're in a sleep. Even that's actually misleading, because when you sleep, you still are, in fact, obviously, aware of certain at certain levels of sensations, but you will not when you're dead. So I find those two arguments very, very comforting. Of course, they're rationalistic answers, right? If you are emotional, if you freak out, that's not going to do it, at least not initially, right? But as Don pointed out early in this discussion, one of the fundamental insights of the Stoics is that, in fact, there is a connection between the way you think and the way you feel. And so the more you repeat to yourself these kind of rational arguments, the more calm you will get about the issue of death.
I always think the issue with Epicurus's beliefs on death is not so much the fear one might have of death for themselves, but the fear of who you leave behind, who will live without you. And that seems to never be as rationally answered, personally.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I mean, even there, however, there are answers like, why are you so worried? I mean, people have always taken care of themselves, and if anything, the best you can do is, in fact, to make sure while you're alive that you are of support to your loved ones, both emotionally and materially, and that's the best you can do. And then once you're gone, humanity has gone on for a long time, so it probably will go on no matter what.
Well, we could probably stick on the topic of death for quite some time, but I do want to move on to address some of the other questions. This one was actually given beforehand and didn't come up in the conversation. So this is from Elliot. He wants to know whether, when it came to religion, the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers were openly agnostic or downright atheists, but somehow still able to live their lives to reconcile those views with the state religion of their day.
Who wants to take it?
I'll perhaps say a few words. I mean, there were one or two people in ancient Greece who were known as atheists, and in fact, there was a book written a few years back by, I think, Tim Whitmarsh on I think it was called "Battling the Gods" on atheism and antiquity, which would be worth looking at if people want to dig a bit further. So we know of one or two who were atheists, and we also know of a couple who were agnostics. So some of the sophists, like Protagoras, who were around at the same time as Socrates, offered agnostic arguments. But people did get into trouble for this, and people were often quite cautious about expressing those ideas. And I think in the Roman context, religion was very closely tied up with the state, and religious practices and rituals had a kind of a political component to them that meant that it was quite difficult to challenge them. And so I think that they were considered important social activities, regardless of whether you believed the metaphysics that was standing behind them. These were things that you really did have to engage in. So I think I think in both of those cultures, their thinking about religion was probably radically different to the way we think about religion today, or the way in which it's been thought about under the monotheistic religions ever since antiquity. And I think it's probably quite difficult for us to get our heads around what they would have understood by religion in those very different cultural contexts.
I'd just like to add to that, I often say Stoicism is a philosophy, it's not a religion. And I really, what I'm alluding to in saying that is there's a tendency for people to project preconceptions that they have about the Judeo-Christian tradition onto ancient religion. And as John said, it's a completely different ballgame and a little bit difficult for us to wrap our heads around. To some extent, it was the external rituals and the performance of religious ceremonies and sacrifices that was more important than the internal state or the faith of the individual. And so people might follow a religion in ancient Greece or Rome externally, but have very different attitudes and interpretations towards what it meant. The Stoics don't believe, as far as I can tell, that we should believe in Zeus or in Providence on the basis of a leap of faith. To them, this is something that they arrive at through reason. And to me, that implies that it's open to being questioned by reason. We can identify maybe a few examples of atheists or agnostics or people that seem sort of semi-agnostic or quasi-agnostic in the ancient world. But on the other hand, in general, many ancient philosophers seem to be familiar with arguments that might be presented by skeptics or agnostics. For example, Marcus Aurelius clearly believes in providence, but nevertheless, he's able to raise questions repeatedly in the Meditations about whether the universe could be the product of random collisions of atoms rather than being ordered by providence. So he's open to thinking through rationally and questioning these ideas. He doesn't kind of treat it as an article of faith in the way that a Christian might. Reason comes first. It's like, religion is the handmaiden of philosophy rather than the other way around, it seems to me, for the Stoics. That's, I think that's all that I have to say about that.
Yeah, I agree with Don. If you read Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, you actually get a very nice set of explanations about all of the major reasons why the Stoics believed in God. And some of those reasons are not particularly convincing. Like, Cleanthus at some point says, oh, well, everybody believes in God, so there's got to be something to it. But some others are much more sophisticated. And, Chrysippus and Epictetus both seem to believe in a general God. They were pantheists, essentially, from a modern perspective. But they seem to believe it because of what we would today call an argument from design. And, Epictetus actually even goes so far as presenting specific examples, specific analogies. He says, look, just like a sword fits exactly into a scabbard, and therefore you infer that it's being made by somebody. The universe seems to be something like that. Therefore, it's got to be. That's an argument from design. And argument from designs are very convincing throughout the pre-scientific era. I mean, the first time that we really get good counter arguments is with David Hume in the 18th century. And then later on, of course, with Charles Darwin in the 19th century. But up to that point, I think I would have, if I were born at the time of Epictetus, I would probably say the same thing. I would say, yeah, sure, that sounds like a very convincing argument to me. But as Don said, because these are arguments, not a question of faith, they are open to counter arguments. And you could say, well, but hold on a second. What about David Hume or Darwin? And then you can come up with a different conclusion.
I'm going to go to a comment from Rogerio, that with regards to the eclectic birth of the tradition of Stoicism. And I guess it's kind of funny as a follow-up to what we just said, but it's a consolidation by Chrysippus seems to follow the pattern that creation is a process which has chaos as its first phase and then order. And it was just an interesting comment to see that and I thought the same with the origins of Stoicism, that it was with Zeno, that you had to have this like eclecticness and then structure afterwards. So it's a good insight.
Maybe Anya, I can just throw in another little bit of trivia, which is my understanding is that after Zeno died, he had a famous breakaway student, a renegade student called Aristo of Chios. And to the best of our knowledge, he appears to have been a kind of agnostic. He said the concept of God was completely incomprehensible, and the study of physics and theology was irrelevant to ethics. And we're told by a number of ancient authors that he had by far the biggest number of followers at that time. His competitor would have been Cleanthes, who was known for writing the hymn to Zeus and having a much more kind of theological or religious approach to Stoicism. So there was a time when perhaps when the majority of Stoics were seemingly agnostic.
I think we've got a follow-up question on the religion just before we move on fully. How likely is it that in the translations from texts written by people living in Greece or the Roman Empire, such as Seneca or Marcus Aurelius, that when we read God, the original word theos or something like Zeus? How often when you're reading the original text was the word God theos or was it Zeus? Like, did he specifically reference Zeus, or I think it was more generic?
I mean, it varies. I mean, sometimes you'll get Theos, sometimes you'll get Zeus. If you've got a good, um, faithful translator, they will reflect that, right? And you'll get God or gods and Zeus in the appropriate places. And you might get some translators who are a bit loose, and they'll just translate it as God all the way through. So, um, yeah, I mean, it will vary from translation to translation. Um, I mean, even if you've got no knowledge of Greek or Latin, if you look at the Loeb Classical Library editions of any of these ancient texts, you can quickly look across at the opposite page and you can see precisely what the terms are that people are using, right? So, you might need to learn a few characters of the Greek alphabet, but you don't need much knowledge to be able to very quickly check this and see precisely what it is they're saying.
Yeah, we should probably clarify that the Stoics were predominantly, although perhaps not exclusively, pantheists of a sort. So when they talk about different Greek gods, they appear to interpret them kind of metaphorically or symbolically as representing different aspects of nature, the Logos or Zeus. And again, if you bear that in mind, you think of Marcus Aurelius was the high priest of the Roman religion. He was the Pontifex Maximus. And so he had to perform these public sacrifices and rituals and prayers. And when he's doing that, he couldn't have really interpreted what he was doing very literally. He must have understood the prayers that he was performing and the sacrifices on a kind of metaphorical level. Like he's sacrificing to an aspect of cosmic nature, not like literally to a kind of anthropomorphic god.
Yeah, and we have an ancient Stoic text by Cornutus, which is full of allegorical interpretations of traditional Greek mythology. And we also know that there was quite an established Stoic school at the library at Pergamum, which, amongst other things, produced allegorical interpretations of Homer and saying, look, this isn't all about these gods running around. We can give a different interpretation of this in terms of our natural philosophy. So that suggests that they were interested in kind of demythologizing some of those traditional beliefs.
I've got a question from Rick. What if Stoic philosophy is a meaningful investment in a larger universal existence? Buddhism believes in rebirth. What if truth is not just about what we can see and feel?
Well, that's a good question, of course. But the problem is, if we can't see it or feel it or otherwise investigate it, then why are we talking about it? All right. So it's always possible to go and speculate on the ultimate nature of reality from a perspective that is not scientifically informed, not empirically based, et cetera, et cetera. But then the question is, on what basis are you doing it? On that, I am very much in agreement with Einstein, who developed an epistemology that is based on evidence. If we cannot actually look at things or hear things or have some kind of data that shows certain things, then we're really not talking about anything. We're just speculating.
This is a different direction for a bit, but I know actually a topic that all three of you can talk about because Massimo, you mentioned that you're going to be having a conference on this, and with John, and I know Donald has spoken about this quite a bit in the past. So this is from Dima. What school has the best way to deal with aggression and people who clearly want to do you harm?
Well, I think Don should start there for sure.
Well, this is one of my favorite subjects as well. And the Stoics, I guess there's a contrast between the Stoic and the Aristotelian position in this regard. The Stoics think that we should eliminate, the Stoics sort of basically think that we should eliminate anger completely. Um, Whereas it's believed that the Aristotelian tradition recognized a role for sort of moderate or righteous anger within certain proportions. Um, most modern psychotherapists would agree with the Aristotelians, except me. I'm more inclined to agree with the Stoics. I think the difference is that if we view anger and other emotions primarily as cognitive in nature, it makes no sense to be moderately in error about something. If anger as an emotion is premised on an error, a philosophical error that places too much intrinsic value on external events, then there is no moderate error that it would be worthwhile embracing legitimately. However, the Stoics have a very nuanced view of emotion, which I think confuses many people because, again, they were way ahead of their time. So they had a much more sophisticated understanding of emotion than the majority of us do today. And they distinguished between the voluntary and involuntary aspects of emotion. We tend to just think of emotion as a horrible homogeneous lump. So anger is just this kind of pressure that wells up within us, which is a kind of idiotic view, if I wanted to give it a name. It's the idiotic theory of anger. It's just a kind of lump of pressure that we vent or we suppress. Whereas anger and other emotions are more like a clockwork mechanism or something like that, or a cake that's baked from many different ingredients. There's cognitive and affective and volitional, physiological aspects of anger. There's different types of anger that we have to distinguish between. But one of the most important distinctions would be in practice, would be to be between the voluntary and involuntary components of anger. So if somebody walks up to you and spits in your face in the street, you'll probably have a kind of automatic reaction to that, and it might be shock or it might be an element of something resembling anger. Seneca recognizes this. He says it's like the blink reflex if something approaches your eye, or the startle reflex if somebody stands behind you and yells boo suddenly. Your heart will start beating and you'll jump out of your skins. It's kind of resembling anxiety or a precursor of full-blown anxiety because it's not really accompanied by the normal cognitive elements that we would associate with anger or anxiety. The fully formed opinions that say you've done something you shouldn't have done and you deserve to be punished. It's almost like something that precedes that we share perhaps with non-rational animals. A dog reacts with something resembling an angry reflex when you try to take its bone away, for example. And small children exhibit something resembling anger. But it's different from most of the experiences of anger that we have as adults, which are largely cognitive in nature and involve certain value judgments and opinions that we hold. So I agree with the Stoics. As long as we make these kind of subtle distinctions and say there's aspects of anger that are maybe non-cognitive or less cognitive and more reflex-like, and maybe we have to learn to accept those with a certain type of detachment and ride them out. What's important is that we distinguish the more cognitive aspects of anger. But the most cognitive aspect of anger would be ruminative anger, where we sit and mull something over and dwell on it and have revenge fantasies and replay arguments in our mind. That's largely voluntary in nature, but people tend to underestimate how voluntary it is. And certainly we can take control of that and begin to question whether it's healthy or unhealthy, begin to question some of the thinking errors that we exhibit when we're ruminating about anger. The Stoics, I believe, other philosophical schools have something to contribute. Let me tell you something. I'm going to say again that the Stoics were way ahead of their time. Let me tell you a little story briefly. I used to train psychotherapists, psychiatrists, counselors, and life coaches for a living. So I'm well used to standing in front of a classroom full of them. And if I had my flip chart out and I said, hey, how many cognitive strategies for coping with anger can you guys name? It's the sort of thing that I would have done quite often. I think they would name 4 or 5, maybe 6 between them at a push. They wouldn't, I think, be able to list 10 distinct cognitive strategies for coping with anger. But that's precisely what Marcus Aurelius does in the Meditation. He gives us a bullet point list of 10 distinct cognitive strategies for coping with anger. Now, that's one of the few places where I would say I'm genuinely quite shocked by what we find in an ancient text, because to me, that really is way ahead of its time. You know, I think modern psychotherapists would struggle to come up with that systematic and extensive an understanding of ways of coping with anger. And here, I'll make one other comment about this, and I don't have an answer to it. To me, the type of person who would be able to do that would be a specific type of individual. It would be normally only a researcher or somebody who's a professional teacher of psychotherapy, like I was in the past, who would have such a systematic overview of the subject. And Marcus was neither of those things. So it kind of surprises me how extensive his knowledge is. I can only speculate that maybe he knew somebody who was a professional teacher of Stoic psychotherapy and had sat down and systematically classified all of the different techniques that he could identify for coping with anger. But the Stoics blow away the other schools of ancient philosophy, in my opinion, with regard to the depth and systematic nature of their knowledge of anger.
Yeah, I agree with Don. In fact, I can add just one more thing, which is in preparation for this seminar that we're doing with John and Rob Coulter on anger, I reviewed some of the current literature because we want to start with like, okay, so what do people think today? And one of the funny things was going through the anger management section on the website of the American Psychological Association, and it's basically Seneca. I mean,
Yeah.
they list, they tell you something about the nature of anger, and that's pretty much Seneca. They tell you something about how to manage it and what kind of things can reduce your being prone to anger, and that's basically Seneca. And yes, I agree again with Don that he's one of the exceptions among modern therapists and psychologists, saying that aligning with the Stoics, basically saying that just anger is just not a good idea, period. They do say, oh yeah, but there is such a thing as good, righteous anger. But after saying that, all they do is to list all these negative consequences of anger and the connections between anger and all sorts of mentally distressful conditions. And all they tell you is really how to get rid of it. So I don't see, even though they kind of pay lip service to this notion that, oh, but there may be something good. There are some aspects of anger that are good. In practice, what all you find is essentially what the Stoics are telling you. Another interesting little thing to notice is that Seneca does talk about different kinds of angers, the kind of, the response that it's not really under our control, that's kind of automatic, as opposed to the festering one, etc. But let's not forget, the title of that book is De Ira, which in Latin translates to on rage, which is, of course, this kind of, Seneca starts out by saying, look at people who are enraged. Their facial structure is distorted. They look like beasts. Do you really want to be somebody like that? And I think that not even modern psychologists or psychotherapists would say, oh, yeah, it's a good thing to be enraged about things. What they really mean is it's good to be disturbed by injustice and by certain things that are clearly, not good, and therefore you want to react to those things. But anger is different.
What would you guys say? And I know we're going to finish up in a moment because I think we've got a bit of a hard stop in about 5 minutes. And this might not be the best last minute question to throw in there. But what would you / Stoics think about the concept of thumos, righteous anger? I think this is kind of applicable now because I think in a lot of modern culture, there is this concept of righteous anger being acceptable. Like, oh, you've got to get angry if you're going to sort of fight against the man and whatnot. And this is, of course, is a very important theme in the Homeric epics. Is there ever a point to righteous anger?
No, I don't think so.
I'll take this question if you don't mind. I'll try and be brief about it, right? So when we're weighing up anger, there's a whole argument that could fill a book here, right? But it's a very important discussion to have. When we're evaluating with anger, basically there's two questions that we need to ask ourselves. Does the cost of anger outweigh the benefits of it as a way of coping? Or the other way around, right? And the other question that we have to ask is there an alternative to anger that could be used to achieve the same potential benefits. I think there is hardly any situation where there isn't an alternative to anger that would achieve the same positive outcome. In therapy, we usually say to clients, you're confusing anger with assertiveness in many cases. You can behave assertively. In fact, if you wanted to, you could even behave aggressively. You could shout at someone, you could punch them in the nose and bite them, like without necessarily experiencing the inward emotion of anger. They're two different things. Most people fail to distinguish between the behavior and the emotion. If you do that, in particular, there's nothing that you can achieve through anger that you couldn't just achieve through external aggressive behavior, or even better, just rational assertive behavior. But the other point that's really crucial here is that most people are oblivious to the costs of anger, or they're aware of some of them, the social consequences of anger, for example. But anger, by its very nature, biases our thinking in ways that lead us to underestimate the negative consequences of anger. Anger inhibits our ability to evaluate the consequences of our behavior. So that's why people often overestimate its value. It's baked into the very nature of the emotion itself. Angry people usually feel what they're doing is justified or righteous, but then they often regret it afterwards when they're no longer feeling angry and they're able to evaluate the consequences of their actions more fully. Anger is associated with many measurable cognitive biases. I'll give you just one that's particularly important. When people are anxious, they tend to overestimate danger, of course. When people are angry, they typically do the opposite and underestimate risk. And that means they're more likely to place themselves and other people in danger. So, for example, in high-risk situations such as the military, where people sometimes actually valorize the role of anger as a way of coping, they typically underestimate the costs associated with it. Angry people typically underestimate risk and therefore not only endanger themselves more, but will endanger other people around them. And if we realize that our thinking is biased in that way by anger, like it makes it much more problematic. It seems like it would be much more beneficial for us to assess how to respond to situations without having all of those biases clouding our judgments. That's why I think anger is a much bigger problem than most people typically realize. By its very nature, it leads us to underestimate the harm that it's doing.
Yeah, and I would like to add just one more thing, referring to Anya's point about the Iliad, right? Yeah, look at how the Iliad starts. It starts out by telling us the wrath of Achilles, who almost cost the war to the Greeks, right? And he killed endless people because he was angry. It's only when he calms down and he starts reasoning about the issue and starts going back and reconciling with himself with Agamemnon that the war changes. So right there, even in the Iliad, you actually have a very good example of how anger is such a destructive emotion.
Yeah, can I just ask what? Sorry.
No,
go ahead, John.
I was just going to add briefly, when people talk about righteous anger as having some positive benefit today, often what they're talking about is an emotional response to something that they perceive to be unfair or unjust, right? And that they feel as if that angry response is going to motivate them to act in an and Donald's just told us all the reasons why, that's not a good idea, because anger will cloud our judgment. But there are other ways in which we can be motivated when faced with unfair or unjust situations. And that's simply to make a calm, rational judgment that what we've seen is unjust and unfair, right? We can use our values to make that assessment and then decide what an appropriate response would be. We don't need to go through the psychological and physiological response of out of control, irrational anger in order to be able to act.
I just want to amplify what John's saying, that if you ask people what's the benefit of anger, the main answer that they'll give is that it kind of gives them strength and motivation and perseverance to act more vigorously or more aggressively in the face of injustice. But the main price that we pay is that it clouds our judgment. Right? So it would be like causing temporary insanity, making you stupider, right? But more motivated. And that's a toxic combination. Like it's like that meme that says drink coffee, do stupid things faster and with more energy. Anger makes you do stupid things faster and with more energy. Like you don't want to be more vigorous and more motivated when your thinking is impaired.
I can't believe you said that about coffee, though. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
No, but excellent points, and I think it's really valuable for people to understand that, and to think about it, and not even just for themselves, but when we go out and we have conversations with other people, and we talk about politics, and we talk these things, can be very philosophical and abstract, but actually they're so practical in our right here and right now. And when you're trying to have conversations with people about important issues, addressing the value of anger I think is a good one for people to know right off the bat. Now, I realize we're kind of reached our time, and our panelists have been so generous with their time. I want to say, first off, I can see that there have been so many questions and so many comments in the chat. I really, really love seeing everybody being very active. I want to say there was a few general, like not repeated, but thematic question threads that we didn't get a chance to address. One of which was basically, where can you learn more about a lot of these ideas? How can you introduce these ideas to other people? And I will say, legitimately, I've had the pleasure of reading our panelists' books, and they are actually this excellent starting points to both learn more about these topics and to introduce them to other people. So in the follow-up email, I will be including links so that you can find those resources yourself and enjoy learning more about this topic. There was also quite a bit of discussion in the questions about the relationship between Stoicism and Buddhism. This is a fascinating topic, but entirely warrants a conversation of its own. We did, by chance, at Classical Wisdom do an event on this when I recently was in Asia. So I'll also send a link to that to address that in a separate conversation. And as I say, I'll send the recording afterwards. So anybody who wants to have a re-listen, you can check your email. If I don't get it out today, I will definitely get it out tomorrow. And I just want to say thank you so much to Massimo, to Donald, to John, for the three of you guys to join me in this conversation. I easily could talk at length, much more. And I think people will be happy to hear that, but I appreciate we all have sort of different time zones that we're in, and that it's getting late for you guys specifically. I also want to thank Sean, John Kelly, who's in the background helping us out. And also, as always, our wonderful community. I'm always absolutely amazed that exists on the internet, wonderful, lovely people. And every single time we have an event, I see that in practice happening. So thank you for your interesting comments, for your interesting questions, for your conversation amongst yourselves, and for joining us. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you all. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Thanks
for
so
having
much.
us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.